As we near the end of Notebook on Cities and Culture's first season, let me first say thanks again to all of you who funded it on Kickstarter. Next season, we'll begin the show's world tour by talking with cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene all over San Francisco and Portland. We just need to raise the funds for the season on Kickstarter between Wednesday, June 25th and the end of the month. For details, visit colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. The Los Angeles Times website credits you with focusing on the changing face of Los Angeles. What's something that's changing?
I think a whole lot is changing, and I think a lot of it has to do with transit and mobility, and the fact that we're building out this really comprehensive transit system for the first time in several decades. So I would put that at the top of the list, a kind of redefinition of mobility and how we get around the city. But also, I think I think in all sorts of ways, Los Angeles is trying, not always succeeding, but trying to redefine itself for the 21st century after being so closely connected with the automobile, with the idea of kind of private amenity, and with the single-family house. I think it's grappling with a different future that is more about slightly denser neighborhoods, about a broader definition of mobility that's not just about the car, and a broader definition of, say, residential architecture, which is not just about the single-family house in the sort of suburban neighborhood. So some people, I've described it and others have described it as a kind of moving toward a post-suburban moment, and I think that encompasses all those things that I was just mentioning. So I think a lot of things are in flux around those questions, and that's actually what makes it such a great time to be writing and thinking about LA. I think unlike most of the big cities in this country, LA still faces a lot of fundamental questions about what kind of place it's going to be. That's nothing new. It's always faced those kinds of questions, but it continues to. And I don't know that that's the case in a city like San Francisco or Seattle or Chicago or New York. It may be true in the kind of Sunbelt cities that developed and had big periods of growth in the same time period that LA did in the 20th century. So those cities are facing some of the same issues, but I think the number of questions, the number of sort of existential questions that LA faces is unique among the big cities in this country.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from the top of the Disney Concert Hall in downtown Los Angeles, speaking with Christopher Hawthorne, architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times. He is also the co-author of The Greenhouse, New Perspectives on New Directions, right, in sustainable design. There we go. I always forget which word that actually is in that title. And he's also doing a number of things. One of the works of his that caught my attention first was the Reading Los Angeles series he did for a whole year, read some of the famous and less famous, but maybe they deserve to be famous books on Los Angeles, and explored the city that way. Now he's doing a series on boulevards. You can go to latimes.com and you can see he's done Atlantic Boulevard and Sunset Boulevard, explored them, written about them, documented them on video, and used them as a way to see exactly what is changing, as we just discussed, in Los Angeles. Now, a lot of these writers that you covered in Reading Los Angeles, they remind me of other narratives of Los Angeles from New Yorkers and Europeans that came to Los Angeles, especially in the early 20th century. And the architecture would seem to get under their skin in a visceral way and just get their mouths foaming almost. And I wonder, you didn't grow up in Los Angeles. Coming to Los Angeles, does any of that sort of mouth foamingness remain about the built environment here?
It does. Actually, that question of how outsiders and natives have looked at LA would have been one. I just laid the series out chronologically. I read and wrote about the books chronologically, but that would have been another way, I think a really interesting way to frame the series look first at books by natives or insiders, and then at books by outsiders, because there has been that tradition of either wonderment, praise from those who have loved this city as outsiders, like Rayner Banham, or disdain and disgust at the city, which is it has been such a common reaction and continues to be. I often think about there was a review in the New York Times of Rayner Banham's book the headline was "In Praise of Los Angeles," and after the word praise was an exclamation point in parentheses. And so just this shock at this idea that anyone would write an entire book praising Los Angeles. And I think there's still some of that in terms of national coverage of the city. In terms of my own reaction, I've been surprised how much I like it. I grew up in Berkeley, as did my wife, and we were both sort of indoctrinated, trained, as most kids in the Bay Area are, to dislike Los Angeles, or at least distrust it.
Well, what are you supposed to think Los Angeles is when you're growing up there?
I think a kind of wasteland, a place without a defining character, a place without culture. And I think that's the thing that is the worst reading of all, given how much is happening here culturally. And so when I go back to the Bay Area quite a bit and still spend a lot of time in Berkeley, and I think more and more it strikes me as every time I go back, it seems more beautiful in a physical way and a little bit less interesting, or more staid culturally. Seems to be less going on compared to Southern California. I grew up in North Berkeley in a particularly beautiful neighborhood with overlooking the bay and the Golden Gate Bridge, and that part of it still strikes me. That the kind of physical landscape, although of course we have pockets of great beauty in LA, the kind of typical stretch of kind of civic landscape that you see in places in parts of the Bay Area like North Berkeley is, I would say, dramatically more beautiful in a traditional sense than most of LA, and that plays into some of those stereotypes too. That the physical landscape of LA is marked mostly by ugliness. But as I said, I've been surprised how much I've liked it. I think my wife, who works in the classical music world, feels the same way, how much is going on here. And just, as I said before, how much is in flux, how much is up for grabs in a way, how much is being contested, invented, reinvented here in a number of fields. And I think how we make the city is certainly among those in terms of places where those questions are being asked. I'm trying to remember my initial reaction before I, actually moved here. I came down here a lot as a kid, and I had a kind of fascination with it, but I think I fell for a lot of the stereotypes because it's not a place where it's not an easy city to get to know. I think that's one of the first things to say about LA. It doesn't reveal itself to you very quickly, and so as a kid just traveling with my parents, I don't think I got much a sense of it beyond the kind of stereotypes. And I don't know, actually, frankly, I don't know that it was a place that I would have chosen to move either. I lived in New York for several years and then had moved back to the Bay Area after living in New York and Washington, D.C. when I was approached by the LA Times and moved down here to take this job, and it was really the job more than the city that drew me. But in some ways that left me with an open mind, because I was sort of coming here to do this job without really I didn't have a negative attitude. I didn't really have a positive attitude. It just wasn't a place I was thinking about. I was thinking about the kind of San Francisco, New York axis more.
And it seems, I've had this line of thought where if I thought one day I wanted to move to San Francisco, doesn't that mean in a sense I just want to move to New York? And doesn't wanting to move to New York mean I just want to go to Europe? At least Los Angeles is its own thing. Does that framework make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. I think it really is its own thing. And I think one of the traps we fall into here is wanting or hoping that Los Angeles can look more like San Francisco or like New York. And I think that has led us down a lot of paths that haven't been very productive or fruitful in terms of how we make the city. We're sitting in Disney Hall, we're sitting on top of Bunker Hill, and Bunker Hill is a really good example of that. we have looked at Bunker Hill and Grand Avenue in particular often as a place where we could create our own kind of Broadway or Champs-Élysées, looking at New York and Europe and forgetting we have our own Broadway right down the hill, which in many ways does all the things we want Grand Avenue to do. It attracts pedestrians. It's full of life. It kind of has an urban energy that Grand Avenue has never had. And so there has been a tendency, I think, to look to those models that aren't very appropriate. And I've been encouraged, actually, even in the time that I've been here, that there's been a shift, in some ways a subtle one, but a noticeable shift in terms of where we find our cultural models. I think we're looking more to Asia, and more to Latin America, which are places that make much more sense. In terms of the demographics of the city, we're looking for our cultural leaders from those parts of the world. We're looking to cities in those parts of the world for inspiration. Gustavo Dudamel, who's the music director here at Disney Hall with the LA Phil, coming from Venezuela. You have the heads of the architecture schools at USC and UCLA coming from Japan and China, respectively. I've written about cities like Medellin in Colombia. And I think those cities, and also, as I mentioned before, cities in the American West and Southwest and Sunbelt are cities that have much more in common with us and that should be part of that kind of dialogue. And as we think about the city, rather than measuring ourselves against Chicago or New York, when that doesn't always make a whole lot of sense or doesn't really lead us anywhere productive.
Maybe I can play devil's advocate against myself for a second here and say, but if you let Los Angeles be its own thing, I mean, is that not what made it the sort of famed hellscape of freeways and quote unquote wasteland? I mean, was that a product of Los Angeles being treated as unique, or was that something else?
I think it's a really key question, actually, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot, because the flip side of the ugliness, or let's say part and parcel of the ugliness, was a kind of freedom, and the freedom culturally that prevailed here for, let's say, much of the 20th century did allow for a kind of did produce a kind of free-for-all and produce a lot of ugliness, and it produced a cityscape that wasn't as well planned as other cities, or let's say we didn't always execute our most intelligent plans. But the flip side of that was that same freedom allowed a lot of architects to experiment and pursue a lot of innovative and ambitious ideas. And that really became part of the city's identity, of course, for so much of the 20th century. And I think the question now is, as we pay more attention to the public and the shared spaces of the city, to the kind of collective idea of what the city is, and we try to do a little bit better in terms of executing our better plans, is there a price to pay in terms of innovative architecture at the level of the individual building? And do we run the risk of moving away from a kind of identity, a kind of authentic identity, even if that identity includes freeways that are clogged and not the most attractive cityscape? I mean, that cityscape has been an inspiration, right, to so many great architects, to so many artists who have really found in that very cityscape a kind of symbol of the kind of freedom that's here. And we can't forget that so many people came here to escape. The people who chose to come to LA, writers, architects, artists, so many of them came to escape the weight of history and the weight of a kind of collective idea of the city. They didn't want to be in a place where there was that sense that everybody was together in one kind of civic enterprise. And that's why I think so many architects and artists and writers from London and particularly London have come here and found it to be so immediately attractive to them, because they just felt that sense of openness and freedom. So the question is, as we, I think you can say that and appreciate that and still say that it's a different era and we need to think about different definitions of what constitutes innovation and ambition now. And I think it does need to come not just at the level of the building, but at the level of the city. And so I've been thinking about ways that we can try to apply that same spirit to a larger canvas, and do it in a way that's really true to the spirit and the history of LA. And that was one of the reasons I did that reading project, was to kind of reorient myself after having been here for 6 or 7 years, with some of those earlier plans and definitions and stereotypes and all of that, before, as a way to kind of reground my criticism and thinking about remaking the city, to not forget about what attracted people here, how the freeway, just to pick an example, really wasn't it a symbol of freedom, democratization of mobility in a lot of ways, and not to forget about that past as the city does try to reinvent itself in some ways.
It makes me think of a piece of architecture that some might consider trivial. Actually, two of them. I've seen foreign visitors marvel at the giant cement donut on top of Randy's in Inglewood, and I believe there's another one you've written about on Atlantic Boulevard in Compton, another cement donut on the roof, I think. And there's this combination of being thrilled and offended you see from foreign visitors when they'll see these giant donuts. And to me, I grew up on the West Coast. I've always lived on the West Coast. It's sort of like what's the big deal? Of course, they sell donuts. It's a giant donut on the roof. But things like that seem to really psychically impact people from elsewhere in a way that I can't fully grasp. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I can't say that I've seen people react that way. The Randy's and Dale's are both icons of a certain sort in LA. I think of them as just landmarks of kind of commercial strip architecture, and being just instantly recognizable signs to people in cars. But I think if there is something offensive about them, it's this idea that they don't subscribe to any kind of conventional ideas of architectural taste, or
there's kind of a, how could they do that? And it's like, well, how? Well, they got a mold and they filled it with concrete. I think in the practicalities, and they're thinking a different how.
Right. No, I think that's very true. And there is a kind of sense of people coming to gawk at architecture like that. But I think that, again, that's what a lot of the most brilliant artists and architects of, let's say, the post-war era played into. I think Frank Gehry, for a long time, has played into that sense of bourgeois or more conventional taste, and a lot of artists, of course, Ed Ruscha has played with that for a long time, and a lot of writers too have incorporated the offense that the city seems to cause for a lot of people. It seems to, the kind of anger that you mentioned before, the foaming at the mouth that it produces, and try to turn that reaction, or incorporate that reaction as a kind of building material and fold it into their work. And I think a lot of the architects who've understood LA best, particularly kind of the LA school architects, really did, consciously or not, incorporate that reaction and that idea about violating kind of conventional taste, and fold it into their work in a lot of ways.
I think it was in Annie Hall. I think of Woody Allen being driven around Los Angeles and him saying, really consistent architecture, very sarcastically, as if the goal of a city was to be architecturally consistent, which is another line that just kind of rang false to me in a way, like, yeah, I guess it isn't consistent, but what's your point?
Right. Well, we could have a whole conversation about Woody Allen and architecture and cities. I wrote a piece when Midnight in Paris came out, after having been frustrated with that movie, and hearing so many people whose taste I tend to agree with in movies just rave about it, and then just being so frustrated by the kind of nostalgia and limited view it had of, again, as you say, what cities are for and how they ought to operate, and sort of celebrating this pantheon of modernists in that film who were dedicated to sort of overturning convention and bourgeois taste, and at the same time really seeming to celebrate a utterly conventional view of a city like Paris and what makes a city attractive. And a lot has been said about his feelings about LA. For me, it was more it was easier to write about when he was looking at a different city, and leaving out, as I wrote in that piece, leaving out the one modernist who should have been included was Le Corbusier, who of course was dedicated to raising all of those beautiful uniform, consistent, streets with their cobblestones and mansard roofs and replaced them with something else. So there were all the artists and painters and writers who were in that same circle essentially, but he was the one pretty glaring omission. So yeah, he's one of there's a long line, of course, of, as you mentioned before, of people coming here and not really giving the city, not really trying to think about the city on its own terms. I think that's the biggest frustration that those of us who find LA to be a more layered place than its critics have tried to argue. The most frustrating thing is just that they haven't tried to think about it on its own terms or understand it. And I think that's has something to do with criticism. I think that's in some ways the first responsibility of the critic, is to understand, whether you're writing about a novel or a movie or a building or a city, understand the thing on its own terms and what the artist was trying to do, trying to accomplish, and then you can take issue with it. You can take that kind of critique in any number of directions. That can just be a beginning point, but I think you have to try to start there. And I think too many people who have written about LA or visited and written it off have not taken the time. And that's the thing that always amazes me, is one of the most persistent stereotypes is that LA is superficial, and I think that's the one that's the least accurate. It's the most layered city that I've ever lived in. I've lived in a lot of cities around the country, and it's difficult to even get to scratch that surface. And I don't think people are using the word superficial in a literal way when they say that. They're talking about vanity. They're talking about a certain idea of kind of West Side, plastic surgery / vanity, celebrity culture. But that word somehow is stuck, superficial, and I think that's the thing that surprised me the most, is how false that is, actually.
And I've heard some say, they'll acknowledge there is a layeredness. They'll acknowledge that you do have to work a little harder to find what's fascinating about Los Angeles, that it doesn't come to meet you. But then they will say, but why should I have to do that? Why can't it be a little more present to me? And is that the fascinating stuff, the good stuff in Los Angeles? Is that its nature? It just can't because of what it is, or is it unnecessarily hidden to some degree? Can we unearth it and make the goodness of Los Angeles more accessible?
I think it has to do more with the differences between understanding or reading an object and understanding or reading a city. So that it's just more difficult to do it at the level of a city, and therefore we want cities to have a kind of uniformity. As you said, we want them to be consistent because it's so difficult otherwise to understand them, and it really does take so much effort and time. Whereas with a building that is a discrete object, as complicated as it is, or as layered as it is, there's a sense that if you spend a couple of hours or a whole day with the building, you can begin to understand it, even if it's trying to be willfully complex or even difficult. And cities are just much harder to understand on that level, even the fairly simple ones. And then, so when you take a city like LA, it just really confounds this idea that you're supposed to be able to get a handle on something quickly. And so I think of Houston as being an extreme example of that case. I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I've been there a couple of times recently, and I really liked it. And I think it was understanding LA and having spent so much time thinking about LA that prepared me to like a city like Houston, which is in some ways LA in extreme form and difficult to understand. It throws a lot of visual information at you. It's not uniform in any way. It's sort of dedicated to the idea of being the opposite of that. And I think as a result, it has pockets for there seems to be a lot going on there culturally, and I was really surprised, came away thinking about it a lot. I came back, it's like when you see a movie, and an interesting test of a movie is how much it kind of pops into your mind or even in your subconscious after you see it. And I found that with Houston, that I kept coming back to it and thinking about it in a lot of ways, even after just visiting briefly a couple of times and not really knowing the city that well. So I think cities are difficult that way, and they're so overwhelming to our senses. And I think if we don't have the energy or the time or the inclination to really dig through them, we tend to prefer the ones that show us a more consistent face. And I think those are the ones that maybe are more beautiful in a conventional way. And LA has never been accused of being that, I don't think.
And I do wonder, people who insist that Los Angeles has been bent out of shape or made grotesque by the car, they could look to a Houston for all of its good qualities, or to a Phoenix and see, yes, much more extreme examples. So I do wonder why Los Angeles still is the lightning rod for that. I mean, I don't even have a car here, and it's fine, but I don't think I'd try that in Houston necessarily.
Right. Well, that gets back to this issue of layers. I mean, LA did have, of course, this whole history before the car, and it had this whole transit system before the freeways. It had, in some ways, the most ambitious transit system in the country, if not the world. A private system, though, which is an interesting distinction, mostly financed with private money and connected, of course, very tightly with real estate speculation. But it had this rich history before the freeway and before the car, and that made the freeways more disruptive here than they were in other cities that were younger, like Phoenix or Houston. And so there were parts of Southern California where the freeway did not go through existing neighborhoods. It didn't have the kind of disruptive quality that it had in New York during the Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs debates, or in San Francisco. But there were plenty of neighborhoods that it did have that kind of quality, and there's still signs of that kind of scarring across LA of the freeway having cut through existing neighborhoods that had been there for many, many decades. And so I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't know why it is that we, despite that history, think of LA having been born in that era or formed by it, or its identity having been forged by the freeway system. I mean, I think maybe it's just the extensive nature of the network here has just covered so much territory. And, really one of our there's so many periods of explosive growth in LA's history. One of the biggest periods of growth did coincide with the freeway building era, so that really reshaped the city. So I think people are responding to the scope and the scale of that system, which is pretty remarkable. And even the fans of the freeway system here, like Rainer Banham, were responding to the sheer scale of it, and how many of these freeways they were, and how much territory they were covering.
Given the changing face of Los Angeles that you write about, I was watching again this morning your videos on Sunset Boulevard, and it seems like for everything that changes here, for every transit system that gets put in place, for every public space that gets made out of seemingly nothing, there's these spots where the city seems to just have said, fuck it. Like, where the sidewalk, runs out when you get west far enough on Sunset Boulevard. You know what I mean? These little spaces where it's, clearly somebody threw up their hands here. I mean, what's going on with those?
Well, it's interesting. I've been... I'm always interested to see what people's reaction to my pieces is, and particularly with the Boulevard series. And in general, I've gotten very good feedback. I've gotten much more positive feedback than I generally do. I mean, typically there's always a pretty healthy percentage of people who are emailing or calling to disagree with me, or call me an idiot, or tell me how little I know. And in this case, people are responding, I think, just to the fact that we're trying to look at the city from a different perspective, and people have been very positive. But if there has been one negative reaction, it's a kind of cynicism, a kind of jadedness, which I think is the same kind of cynicism that I've seen about the transit system here from a certain generation of commentators, observers, pundits about Los Angeles, and their reaction to my writing about the fact that there's no sidewalk is, of course, it's a who would ever want to walk on Sunset Boulevard and that, in the Palisades? You drive on Sunset. That's how you get across that part of the city. And the idea that I would even raise that as an issue, or be struck by the fact that there's no sidewalk there on this major boulevard cutting across the city, or even the bus stops. I mean, these bus stops that were the two stops where they're literally using people's front lawns to put a bus stop down because there's no public right-of-way at all. And they have tried to, they have not just tried, they've succeeded in adding bus service on that part of the boulevard, but they've had to squeeze it into this street that is just so resistant to the idea of accommodating the public in that way. So I have had a certain amount of reaction from the same people who are really cynical that we'll ever build a transit system that matters here, or wonder why, as an architecture critic, I'd be writing about things like transit and Measure R and so forth, or the politics of paying for transit, or the architecture of transit stations, things like that. Some of the same people have been pretty cynical about the fact that I would even raise this lack of sidewalks. And their response is, of course, that's just how LA is made. And if you raise an issue like that, you sort of don't understand. There's always beneath the surface, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, a sense of that in that critique that you don't really understand LA and how it operates. And we're never going to be a city that thinks about getting around and thinks about mobility in that way. But I do think there's a significant shift going on. I want to be careful about saying it's just a generational shift, because it's not just about that, but it's certainly partly generational. And I just happened to notice that most of the people I interviewed for the Sunset piece happen to be, in their 30s and 40s. And I think for them, and certainly for people in their 20s here, there's a different set of assumptions. I think they're beginning to assume that we are going to be a city with a mature transit system. We are going to be a city that offers a lot of ways to get around. And we are going to be a city where it's going to seem odd that there's not a sidewalk on Sunset Boulevard, this famous, glamorous, street that cuts across LA, and that they're going to see that as an anomaly rather than something that one shouldn't express surprise over. And I think that's really. I kind of had a hunch about that coming into the series, but as I spend more time doing the reporting on the Boulevards pieces, that's been really confirmed for me, that split and that sort of gulf, that gap between assumptions about the city, that both among younger people and people who have come here from elsewhere, whether that's cities, other American cities or elsewhere in the world, they have different expectations about how the city operates, ought to operate, will operate, and I think that's really beginning to put a physical stamp on the city and how it's designed in ways that, frankly, make some people uncomfortable. There are a lot of people still who don't understand why we would invest in things like trains and buses or even high-speed rail. The way the debate over high-speed rail has been framed, there's so much cynicism that we would ever invest in something like that.
So I always want to say, Japan got this in 1964. I realize they have 4 times the population, but almost 50 years on, maybe, there's a chance you could catch up. When you write about transit, you do capture something about the way that when things get built in Los Angeles, a lot of times the branding can exceed the implementation a little bit, enough to be frustrating. It's like Metro, who builds these train lines and such, they do give a lot of lip service to design, maybe slightly less service to design. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, and I think that's one of the reasons I've written about transit so much is that Metro, thanks to Measure R, has become one of the most significant patrons, if not the most significant patron of new architecture in this city. And that's in a city that doesn't have a great track record of ambitious public architecture. That's not to say we don't have great public buildings here, but there's a much higher percentage. If you made a list of the great architectural landmarks of the last century, in LA there's a much higher percentage of those that are residential buildings that are in the private sphere than would be the case in almost any other city that I can think of. And so we haven't had a great tradition of public patronage of architecture, of great architecture, the way some other American cities have had. And as I said, there are historical reasons for that. There have been, we don't want to give up on the idea of innovation in the private sphere, and there's such a rich history there. But we are turning, thanks to the recession, thanks to the decline in private investment in building in the last few years, and on the flip side, because of this public investment, thanks to Measure R and the investment in high-speed rail, there is money being spent on public architecture by transit agencies of various kinds around the state, and particularly in LA. And so we have to, I think it's really crucial to have a conversation about the design aspects, the urban design, public design, architectural aspects of that construction. And it's not all discouraging. I think the Orange Line busway, which has just been extended, and particularly the bike lane and walking paths that have accompanied that, and even the bike path that goes along the Expo line, some of the landscaping has been, I think, pretty well done. I wish, as I've written, that the stations themselves could be better architecturally and also reflect a more sophisticated kind of conversation about the role that these buildings, these stations, will play in the civic life of the city. And I'm frustrated by the level of conversation around that and level of debate, the way that Metro has approached its task in that sense, and not just Metro. I mean, I've written similarly about LAUSD, which had a major school building campaign in the first few years. Well, after I got here and started at the LA Times. So I think we need to. I mean, the irony is that, as I said, LA is attractive as a subject because so much is changing, so much is in flux. There's so many basic questions that the city is answering or trying to answer. Other cities that are more fixed, like New York, like San Francisco, like Chicago, have a lot of platforms and institutions for having this kind of conversation and debate. And LA is the city that needs it the most and has the fewest of those, I think, platforms. And again, we have to realize this is a complex subject in many ways, that the lack of those institutions and the lack of that kind of collective conversation and attention, again, was something that was attractive and has been attractive and probably continues to be attractive to a lot of people coming to Los Angeles, because they didn't feel the weight of there wasn't a sense that your neighborhood was looking over your shoulder, that there was that sort of close sense of community that there can be in older cities. But I do think that we need to have a better conversation or series of conversations about things like Metro and architecture. And we don't have enough platforms, enough places, enough institutions to have that kind of discussion.
You mentioned the residential architecture here, and certainly in the last 20 years, there hasn't been much shyness about celebrating that heritage, especially these sort of mid-century modern type houses that you see. I mean, people who've never been to Los Angeles see these all the time, and myself growing up in Seattle, 1,000 miles away, I just thought as a teenager, wow, those houses are so cool. Nothing I want more than one of those houses in Los Angeles. And then I visit them, and architecturally, they're still great, but they're in such alienating places. They're in like the Hollywood Hills or way on the coast, or maybe over in Malibu. It's like they're in places that make me lose the will to live because of how remote they are. The buildings remain aesthetically fascinating to me, but do you get what I mean about that sense that you're like, why are they here? Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, even the way they were photographed, even the way they were sold and marketed, I think picked up on a lot of that sense of isolation. And in fact, that sense of isolation has not been restricted. Sense of isolation from the rest of the city has not been restricted to houses. I mean, that has even been a characteristic of really important public buildings here too. If you think about the Griffith Observatory or the Getty Center or Dodger Stadium, there's a whole long history of these more public buildings that are also sort of completely detached from the city around them. Those iconic pictures of the observatory all suggest its distance from the rest of the city. And of course, the most famous, probably the most famous picture of any LA building, the Julia Schulman picture of the case study, the Pierre Koenig house, showing it sort of cantilevered out over this, the grid of the city below, and really emphasizing that distance, that sense of isolation from the larger city. And there were architects who, not just in how they framed the buildings or sold them or photographed them, but even how they designed them played into that. I'm thinking of like the, John Lautner's houses in particular. The Chemosphere house is kind of spaceship in that way, really emphasizing that detachment. So even in the way that they were photographed and then in the places they were built, there is that absolutely that sense of isolation, that they're and that leads into a critique, maybe a too easy critique of programs like the case study program, that they were never able to forge any kinds of connections between that architecture and the city, that they were kind of ended up being one-offs that weren't replicable in the way that maybe the authors of that program were hoping that they might be, that they never it never became possible to make whole neighborhoods or even parts of neighborhoods with that kind of architecture. But that's part of the appeal. There's a kind of glamour and exotic appeal about them, precisely to the degree that they're not like other houses and they're not in neighborhoods that are like other neighborhoods, or that they're floating completely free of the idea of neighborhood context. I mean, that's certainly how they were photographed. The most powerful of those photographs all suggest that those houses are floating completely free of any kind of neighborhood context or neighborhood around them.
Very much a last man alive kind of situation. Here's your house, I notice, I'm glad when someone from elsewhere can visit Los Angeles and see houses like that, like case study houses, just to get an aesthetic idea of what's gone on here. But they always, those houses always come in a list of other spots people see in Los Angeles and then hightail it out. They see the Sunset Strip, they see Hollywood Boulevard. I was with a Korean friend in front of Hollywood Highland the other day and just apologizing that this building even exists. I don't think she understood what I was saying, but I was just like, this isn't representative. But for a lot of tourists, the worst things in the city have remained representative. Why?
Well, I think that's true of tourism in general, and I don't think
Fisherman's Wharf comes to mind.
I don't think it's unique to LA. I have talked to so many European tourists whose itinerary in America is flying to Miami, spending 4 or 5 days in Miami Beach, flying to Las Vegas, renting a car, driving across the desert to Los Angeles, maybe going to San Francisco from there by plane or driving up the coast. And I
Grand Canyon usually is involved somewhere.
Yeah, and I think we're guilty of the same thing in Europe, of course, of going in and seeing the kind of greatest hits and leaving. But maybe LA is, again, because of all the things we've been talking about, because it doesn't lend itself to easy readings, because it doesn't open itself up particularly quickly. If you're coming in for a limited amount of time, I think you're even more tempted maybe to see the kind of Hollywood landmarks and think that either leave it at that or think that represents the larger city. But for me, Hollywood Highland is a great example of the layers that are here. That, one of the things that this didn't make it into my final version of Sunset, but when Griffith built the set for Intolerance out on Sunset Boulevard and then left it there, or it was left there for many years after the filming was done, it became a kind of architectural landmark and then a ruin over time. And it became as much an architectural presence on Sunset as any quote-unquote real building. And then it was really that set that became the architectural inspiration for Hollywood and Highland with the elephants and so forth. So that kind of cultural traffic and the way that things travel from illusion to reality and maybe back again in LA is such a part of the story, and I think a fascinating one. So even though we all have our problems architecturally and from an urban design point of view with that complex, it does suggest some of the layers that are here that people aren't always thinking about, that we assume exist in older cities and we kind of don't look for here all the time. But they're really everywhere, just the way they are in any city of LA's age.
But since you're from the Bay Area, let me run this by you. Doesn't it seem like visitors to San Francisco get past Fisherman's Wharf eventually, even if they start there? They see the actual stuff sooner or later. Here, they may see Hollywood Boulevard, Sunset Strip, and they may leave after that.
I don't know. I occasionally do tours with groups from Europe, say, and I get a sense of what they're seeing. But I also think there's a great history of travelers, even tourists, coming here and trying to understand the city at a different level. There's a great website called You Are Here. I don't know exactly what the URL is, but it's a German guy who I think spends almost all of his vacation time coming to LA and documenting the architecture of the city in a really thorough and admiring and sophisticated way, really trying to understand the city on its own terms, the way we've been discussing. And I think there's a history of people like that, like Rainer Banham and others, who have really made an effort to scratch the surface. And in part it's because the city is immediately so dramatically different maybe from the cities that those people are coming from.
There is another way that I've not found, because it's been partially, in large part, because you've been writing this way, but because of also books that I've read about Los Angeles, because of talking to people who think about the city in certain ways that I haven't. There's another way of looking at it, which is to look at the streets, like the Boulevard series you've been writing. And when people ask where to go, I do find myself replying with, well, you might want to check out Wilshire between Western and downtown or wherever else. And it seems like, I don't know, is there a shift toward thinking about the streets rather than the freeways, rather than the sort of mega areas of the city, or is that just another way of perceiving things around here?
I think there's definitely a shift toward neighborhood and thinking of the city in a more circumscribed way, and I think that's good and bad. That's primarily because of traffic, and that's primarily on the west side, because it's just not possible to move around the city the way that it used to be, particularly on the west side where there aren't as many transit options. There's still ways to get around. Our bus system, of course, is better than most people give it credit for. But there's a sense that people are, and not only staying in sort of tighter orbits, but they want to do that, and they want to figure out a way to organize their lives so they're in the car less. This is true for me and a lot of people I know, wanting to organize our lives so that we don't have to be driving and covering as much territory. But the risk of that is that you move away from, I think one defining characteristic of LA which is this idea of mobility and the idea that that all of these parts of the region are part of one city, so that the city and our mental map of the city, our mental idea of the city includes the beaches and the mountains. It includes, the valley and Orange County and that all these places that we used to be able to take in and get to pretty easily, and that old cliche about everything being 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it's now more like 40 or an hour away. But there was always that idea that you could get to most of the city in a pretty easy drive, and that idea has broken down completely. And so the good thing about that, the benefit of that, is that people are paying more attention to their neighborhoods. And that in turn means a growing, this is something I've written a lot about, a growing constituency for the design of the public sphere and how we treat the public sphere. That's, sidewalk design and streetscape and all of those things that we have neglected for a long time here. The downside is that the one idea that held together this incredibly big, diverse city, it was that idea of connectedness around and connectedness by mobility, mostly by car, but not entirely. And if that begins to break down, I wonder if the larger idea of LA begins to break down, and I wonder what happens after that. So the good thing is that, if you're in a car and you're going from point A to point B, not only are you not really paying close attention to how the city looks between point A and point B, you're not really looking at point A or point B either. You're not looking at the area right around your house or the area right around your destination. And so one of the great things about transit is that, most trips on transit begin and with a trip on foot or, a trip on a bike. And so if you're walking to the train station or you're walking to the bus stop, you have an opportunity to think about and pay attention to the way the city is designed at that kind of fine-grained level that obviously you don't when you're in a car. So that is something that I think we're still grappling with too. What does it mean? People say all the time to me, and architects say this all the time to me, that they see a change and a renewed focus on neighborhoods and people staying closer to home and thinking about their own neighborhood. And what that means for the design of those neighborhoods and what that means for this larger definition of Los Angeles, of Southern California, I think we're just beginning to kind of figure out and grapple with. And that's, I think, one of the most fascinating topics in terms of covering this city.
It's a framework you can always use when you're writing about anything here, that there's that sense of what level are we thinking about this city on?
Yeah, and that's been one of the really illuminating things for me about the boulevards is I've really tried to move along them in a number of ways. So on foot, on a bike, I've driven, of course, I've taken the bus, I've taken trains to the extent that they're there. I went up in a helicopter, actually, with Jeff Manon, with Nicola Twilley, two writers who used to live in LA. We're back here, and thinking about that kind of top-down view, and thinking about the kind of that range of ways of getting around the city. And so for me, I'm still in the early stages of thinking about Crenshaw, which is the next boulevard I'm writing about, but sort of playing around with the planes, trains, and automobiles theme, given how much car culture has been connected to Crenshaw, cruising culture and lowrider culture, and the fact that there's now going to be a Crenshaw rail line down the boulevard, and the Expo line crosses Crenshaw. There was a streetcar line there for many decades, and then of course the number of airports and the connection with the aerospace industry along Crenshaw has made me think that that might be a framework for writing about this boulevard, is the range of ways that we think about and define mobility. And in that particular case, in Crenshaw's case, it's also been connected really directly to industry, to economic development, to some themes that aren't just about architecture, that are also about how the city was made from an industrial and an economic and an employment point of view, and how those things are shifting as well.
I've been speaking on top of a Disney Concert Hall in downtown Los Angeles with Christopher Hawthorne. He is the architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times. He wrote that series, Reading Los Angeles, on the books about Los Angeles, and he's now doing a series on the boulevards of Los Angeles. Of course, as we've talked about, Atlantic Boulevard, Sunset Boulevard, and coming up next, Crenshaw Boulevard. Christopher, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.